my name is Sarah and today we're talking about book buying habits. I've mentioned in some of my videos before that I am a reader that does not frequent the library super often. I love the library and I love what it does for communities, but up until this last year I really hadn't gone to the library very often in probably the last 5 to 10 years. Most of the books that I read are books that I own already, that I buy, or that I borrow from friends and family. And based on the fact that I read far more broadly than most of the people that I interact with in my everyday life, that by default necessitates me getting my own books. Because while yes, I do have a lot of friends that have different reading tastes than I do, most of them do not read nearly as much as I do. So there are still a lot of books that they own that I've already read, and as I'm searching and trying to intentionally read more broadly and diversely, I have to go outside of borrowing books from family and friends, which tends to leave me with the options of the library or the bookstore, and for whatever reason I have tended to go to the bookstore a lot more often than I have gone to the library in recent years. So you might have noticed this if you watched a couple of my haul videos from last year, and I know I've mentioned it in some of my hauls, that I am a person that buys my books in spurts. I will go 1, 2, sometimes 3 months without really buying many books at all, and then I'll just buy like 15 all within like a 2-week span. And sometimes it's just because I just all of a sudden am in a very bookish mood and want all of these new books on my shelf. It might be because I have spent the last couple months intentionally trying to knock down my physical TBR, and so then I find myself with only maybe 3 or 4 or 5 unread books sitting on my shelf, and I want a bunch of new ones that I can experience and dive into those worlds and hang out with those characters for the first time. And then every so often it will be because of a situation I ran into this past year with the Lunar Chronicles series. I purchased Cinder in the month of September, read it in the month of October, and decided that I was just going to pick up the books here and there, and eventually I would get to winter and finish the entire series. Then winter came out and everyone was freaking out and was gushing and was super excited, and I wanted to know what was gonna happen, so I just said screw it and I bought the entire series and marathoned it over the next weekend because I just wanted to know what was happening. One of my other book buying habits is that all of my covers have to match. And so if I pick up one book in a series and then don't pick up the rest of the series for months or years or whatever, or all of a sudden learn that there's a book in the series that I didn't know about, as was the case recently with the Time Quintet, I want all of my book covers to match. And so sometimes even if I have 4 out of a 5-book series all in one cover, I will go out and I will buy the entire series all in a new cover set because my books just have to match. It's just a thing that I like to be a thing, and so I then typically wind up selling or donating the extra books or gifting them to families or friends who also want to experience those stories and don't necessarily care as much as I do about their entire series matching. A new book buying habit that I have developed somewhat in the last year or so due to conversations I've had with people, due to a shift in my lifestyle toward minimalism and a bunch of other things, is that in order for a book I've bought to actually stay on my shelf, is that I have to have given it at least a 3.5 star rating. The exception to this is a book series where, for example, I maybe gave the first couple of books in a series 4 or 4.5 stars or whatever, and then the middle book really suffered from middle book syndrome and I gave it 3 stars or 2.5 stars or whatever. I will keep that lower rating on the shelf for the sake of continuity and having the entire series sitting on my shelf. But when it comes to standalones, when it comes to greater series where I don't wind up particularly enjoying them, if I did buy the book and I gave the standalone or the vast majority of the series less than 3.5 stars, it goes off my shelf. And the main reason for that is because I am a rereader. I do reread books frequently, and I've been trying to get a lot more intentional about making sure that I reread regularly my favorites. But if I didn't give a book at least a 3.5 star rating, the chances of me rereading the book are very, very low. And I've had a lot of conversations with people over the years who want to know why I have as many books on my shelf as I do, and do you ever actually read those books again, they ask me. And the honest truth with most of those books is that yes, I do reread them. It might take me 5 years or 7 years or even 10 years between reads of a book or a series, but if I loved the book enough to give it 3.5, 4, or a 5-star rating, I will reread it at some point in my life, and that is part of why I love to have it on my shelf. If I didn't give it at least a 3.5 star rating, which if you watched my How I Rate Books video, you know that that's a story that I really enjoyed, but maybe I had 1 or 2 issues with it that made it not quite a 4-star book, then it definitely has to go, because if it didn't even warrant like this was a really enjoyable story with a couple of issues, then the chances of me rereading it are pretty much slim to none. As my book collection continues to grow over the years, that threshold for whether or not it stays on my shelf may very well wind up bumping up to 4 stars, which again, if you watch the How I Rate Books video, you know that 4 stars are books that I just really enjoyed, and when I finish them, I don't necessarily have any major criticism. And those 4, 4.5, 5-star books are the books that are the highest candidates for me rereading either at least once or consistently in the years to come. So like I said at the beginning of the video, one of my goals for the year is to take the 28 books that I had at the start of this year that were unread on my shelf and read all of those. One of the other things that affects my book buying habits is that I really am trying to keep my number of unread books to 30 or less. Because I am a person that reads fiction and nonfiction, but reads more fiction than nonfiction, I try to keep it a 10-20 split so that no more than 20 of my unread books on my shelf are fiction and no more than 10 of my unread books on my shelf are nonfiction, mostly because it takes me longer to read through nonfiction books and I read a smaller number of those every year than I do read of fiction. If I have not been able to read a lot recently, or I haven't been in the mood necessarily to read the different books that I already have on my shelf, I will try to put my book buying on hold, in which case I might reread books that I already own, or I will go to the library or something like that. But in general, I am trying to keep that physical TBR to a manageable number so that I don't ever get completely overwhelmed by the number of unread books that are just sitting on my shelf and potentially have been sitting there for 2 years or 3 years or something like that, as is the case with some of the books that are currently unread on my shelf. So one change to my book buying habits that started in 2015 and that I am trying to implement more in 2016 is that I really do want to use the library a lot more. I got a new library card last year and I started frequenting the library a little bit more to pick up books that I'd heard some good and some bad things about, and so I really wasn't sure what my opinion on the story was going to be. And a new rule that I am implementing in 2016 is that when it comes to book series, unless I am 100% beyond a shadow of a doubt confident that I am going to love this series, I've decided that when I start new series, I'm going to get the first book from the library and sort of gauge my general interest and love for the series before I put any money into it, so that I don't wind up with a bunch of books on my shelf that I then wind up selling or donating or giving away because they just didn't live up to the expectations that I had. Another one of my book buying habits has to do with star ratings as well, and that is as I am starting to employ the library a bit more. Once I have read a book, unless it is at least a 4-star book, I will not buy my own physical copy of it. And that is obviously a little bit different than the threshold for whether or not it stays on my shelf, which that is obviously 3.5 stars, but the reason I have the 4-star threshold for whether or not I'll buy a book again is because, like I said, 4 stars, 4.5 stars, 5 stars, those are the books I am most likely to reread. And if on my first read I didn't give a book at least 4 stars and I don't already own it, the chances of me wanting to reread it are pretty slim. So I usually will not buy a book that I picked up from the library first if it doesn't get at least a 4-star rating. So there you have it, friends. Those are a few of my book buying habits. I would love to continue this discussion with you guys. What are some of your own book buying habits? Do you have a star rating threshold that a book has to meet before it will be able to stay on your shelf? Do you have a certain number of books that you cap your physical TBR off? Things like that. I would love to continue this discussion with you and learn some of the things that affect how and when and why and what books you happen to buy. If you want to follow me elsewhere online, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Goodreads, all at Sarian Hayes. The links for those profiles will be in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye! If you watched my goal, I've mentioned in some of my videos the people that I interact in, and based on the fact that I so within the that is the thrust. Do you have a star rating that is the thrust?